Hello and welcome to another edition of Another Book Review. This week I'll be reviewing Tomas Piketty's book Capital in the 21st Century. I'll talk very briefly about the author, go into an overview about what the book is about, talk about what I liked about it, what I didn't like about it, who I'd recommend the book to, and finish off with what I'll be reading for next time. Tomas is a Parisian economist and professor. He is best known for writing this book in its original French. It was translated came out about 10 years ago in 2013, exactly 10 years ago this year, and is really his look at the history of income and wealth inequality, not only in his native France, but around the world. Starting at around the year 1800, he has access to property and tax records, mostly in France, but also in essentially the entire European continent. And he makes the claim in this book that the the amount of GDP that goes to wealth any one year can be calculated by looking at the rate of return versus how much wealth is held privately. And by using this formula, he comes to the understanding that unless the economy is growing faster than the rate of return, the average capital rate of return, then wealth inequality increases. And he shows through just a lot of research in the book showing this point kind of again and again. He has access to a database of global wealth and shows that this rate of return is relatively constant throughout recorded history of that about 5%. That's 5% net of inflation before taxes, and no matter what the asset class is. And by looking at this, there's only been a couple times in the history of the world that he shows in the last 200 years or so where the growth rate of the overall economy is larger than that rate of capital. And when you have a growth where the capital rate is higher, you increase income inequality. And really the cataclysmic event that changed everything is World War I, and then following very closely behind World War II. And we saw in the post-war years a increase in the rate of growth in the overall economy. We had around that time of World War I was really when the first income taxes were being put in worldwide, and he shows the impact of that as well on the amount of money or wealth that is going towards capital. It's a huge book. There's a lot there, and he basically goes through. With that being said, he basically shows and breaks down a lot of the mythologies that people have about wealth, the thought that people who earn their wealth typically perform better than people who inherit their wealth, which he shows is not true. Once you begin investing at a high enough level, they're basically the relative return is about the same. He talks a little bit about income inequality versus wealth inequality and how oftentimes those two things go hand in glove, probably for obvious reasons. The more money you make, the more money you're going to have above your needs to invest in the overall capital market. This was a huge book when it came out. I don't think I've ever seen any other book. I should put my cards on the table. This came out, like I said, in 2013. I've probably listened to half a dozen podcasts about this book since that time. So I've heard a lot about the book before reading it. It's been on my to-read list for quite a while. And if you're just going to read one 600-page economics book that's not a textbook, this is probably the one to read. But it was a very controversial book in the sense that everybody from more left-leaning economists to more right-leaning economists to Marxists to libertarians kind of came out and attacked it for various reasons. And so I think for that reason alone, the fact that it's captured so much flack and captured so much vitriol is probably too strong a word, but feedback has really been, I think, the number one book as far as economics books in the last 20 years that I can think of. I think for that reason alone, you probably should check it out if any of that sounds interesting to you. I think income inequality and wealth inequality are kind of two of the driving factors of a lot of the geopolitical issues that we're seeing in the world right now. And I think he does a magnificent job of explaining why this is such a difficult problem to wrap your hands around. He proposes a lot of suggestions of solutions towards the end of the book, but just kind of that's the whole book. It's really the history of wealth inequality, not only in Europe, not only in the United States, but all over the world, wherever he can get really data to show this. He breaks down his argument pretty smoothly into chunks. The first 200 pages is really kind of getting you up to speed of what the terms he uses to mean, what this implication, what this formula R greater than G, what the implications of that are for the world, and then really he's kind of he's his way of fighting is not the right word, but predicting what the arguments against him are going to be and kind of breaking those arguments down piece by piece. And then finally, like I said, there's some solutions. This was written at the tail end of the financial crisis of 2008, and so he has there's a pretty long section about debt financing versus austere. What is the best way to go versus a global wealth tax? And that section is pretty long. So given all the ground that he covers in this book, it's very well written. It's very easy to read. I definitely would say it's very, very dense. That is the one thing. But the writing style, he writes in a way that I think works well for a lay audience if you're willing to put the time in. There's some asides to literature, and there's an Aristocats reference that maybe could have been cut, but otherwise, I think he writes in a pretty breezy style, given the heft of what he's talking about. He has a little bit of snark and a little bit of humor in places, which help it go down a little bit easier as well. But I do think it's about as well written as it could have been, given the amount of ground he has to cover. Um, and the other thing I really enjoyed about it, he has a lot of graphs, but compared to other things I've read, like Aftermath by Philip Bump, he has a lot fewer graphs in this than Philip Bump did in his book. And I think the graphs are really, really laid out well for you to understand the point he's trying to make. Um, but yeah, I think if you're someone who hasn't thought about wealth or economics or how those two things tie together, especially in the last 200 years, I think it is a really interesting jumping off point for a whole host of arguments that you could have. I think in the beginning of the book, he talks about economics in some ways doesn't get down to the level of the social sciences and kind of sees itself maybe above it. And I think he kind of calls that out as not being maybe the most useful thing to be in the world. And I think he uses this as an opportunity to really show some of the ramifications of what he's talking about are for maybe the average person or lower income folks. There is in the book never, I think, a chapter devoted to why growing in wealth and income inequality are bad things. I think it maybe because he is French, that the answer is maybe self-evident, but I maybe wish he would have spent a little bit more time of what that looks like. Um, if there's some things that I didn't like about it, other than the sides to literature, there is a section where he talks about the income inequality and how that's risen over time. And he puts forward the idea that others have put forward that the rise in income inequality from those at the top of the income scale to those at the bottom can be explained by education and training. And he basically poo-poos this idea and says that that's not true, that the reason that we have this increase in income inequality can only be or mostly be explained by the top, the CEOs making just extraordinary amounts of money, more than everybody else below them. And he talks about the change in the tax rates roughly around 1980, where the top marginal rates in many countries, not only in America, but really around the world, in efforts to spur on economic growth, began to cut marginal tax rates. This was coming after a large boom post World War II. The boom was starting to taper in an effort to keep the train a rolling. They lowered the marginal tax rates in hopes that this would kick off some economic expansion, and that didn't necessarily happen. And he shows how that by doing that, it incentivizes the CEOs to argue or negotiate for more money, and in doing so, increases the gap between the marginal worker and the CEO. Now, there's only one CEO at most companies, and so I found this argument to be a little incomplete. It struck me as strange that, given the rise in college-educated white-collar workers over the last 40 years, that would have absolutely nothing to do with the income inequality gap, when we've seen that for blue-collar males, per Richard Reeves' book, Boys and Men, who've actually lost ground in the economy, that also was not a factor. So those two other things, I was surprised that they didn't get much traction in the book, or if at all. So that was one quibble I had with it, where I felt that argument was a little fast, is maybe not the right word, but I wish that he had spent a little bit more time examining the possibilities of it being something different than what the conclusion he comes to. Um, yeah, so I think that this also is an interesting book that's in conversation with other books I've read. Richard Reeves, who I just mentioned, also wrote a book called Dream Hoarders. I think he talks about in this book, Tomas talks about the essentially half of wealth is inherited wealth, and the idea of tying some of those things into the way we see dream hoarders as people who are trying to um, keep other people, the lowering the ability for other people to rise up either through education or through just hard work in finding their way into the middle class or upper middle class. He does talk a little bit about in this book about the difficulties between separating out people who get their money essentially from luck, which would be essentially inheritance, and even those who are lucky enough to be, relatively high paying professionals. How much of that is luck, and how much of that is work, and how much of that is effort is always going to be a jumble of things. And he doesn't really get into, how to best deal with that. I think maybe the most controversial part of the book is probably a couple things that people always mention. The 80%, he basically calls for an 80% marginal tax rate. It wouldn't bring in a lot of revenue, which is maybe not what I would lead with, but it wouldn't bring in a lot of revenue. But what it would do is it would halter or limit the ability for those who are making higher rates of return from continuing to increase the amount of inequality that they have. He also calls for a global wealth tax. This book came out 10 years ago. I don't think we're any closer to a global wealth tax now than we were when this book was written. If anything, I think we're further away. But he basically puts that forward as the best, or most likely the best scenario for reining in income inequality worldwide, given the ability for capital to move physically throughout the world pretty easily, which is only accelerated now that we have so much access to digital currencies. But he talks about that and the need to do that and to have more of a worldwide cooperation when looking at wealth inequality, and how best to serve the globe. He also talks about tax havens, and I think the number he uses is roughly 10% of GDP are in tax havens throughout the world, which is also, I think, a cause for concern for a lot of people. So I'm just looking at my notes real quick. The only other things there, like I said, it is a long book. It's 577 pages. I think the last maybe 50 to 75 pages dragged a little bit, where he starts talking about the EU and what they have done in terms of austerity and the strengths and weaknesses of using debt financing versus using taxation versus using inflation in order to bring in more revenue and to lower the inequality. I thought was interesting, but it does drag on for quite a while. There's some sections of the book that he probably could have made as appendices to maybe make this a little bit shorter. So overall, I think there's probably 100 pages that he could have probably cut from the book. And I found myself towards the end definitely dragging, but for the most part, I did enjoy reading the book. So there are a couple parts where he talks about Gini coefficients and why he doesn't use those, or there's a term called P90, P10, and why he doesn't use that. I think those could have probably been moved. Um, yeah, I mean that's overall. Like I said, I did really enjoy this book. I think for how dense and how uh, interesting of a discussion point it is, especially given how much dialogue and conversation has come in after this book was published. I think it's definitely, if you haven't gotten a chance to check it out, please do. I think you'll be doing yourself a favor. I would go slow on it. Like I said, it is quite dense, and I think if you read it in chunks, I can't think of any other book that I've heard so many people say I've read parts of it than this book, because it is broken into parts, and I think you're likely going to find some of these parts interesting more than others. But I think there's a lot of in the book that basically calls into question things that we had assumed about economics and wealth throughout the last couple hundred years that I think are worth everybody who's interested at all in this stuff or public policy to take a look at. So that is Tomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century. Next time I'm going to be reading either The Looming Tower or Don DeLillo's Libra. But either way, I'll probably take a couple weeks off here for the holidays. I just want to thank everybody for listening. If you've tuned in before, thank you very much. If this is your first time, please feel free to like the channel, like the video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I'll leave the Twitter link below. I'll also leave my links to Dream Hoarders of Boys and Men and Philip Bump's Aftermath. So you can check those videos out if you're interested at all. Until next time, bye.